the League of Women Voters.
Oh, it is. It
Well,
is.
right. All that to say, it's not an election issue. It's a policy issue.
Yes.
It matters
Yes.
to all. And matters really more than just about any other specific policy issue that I can point to right now. But it also matters from election perspective, I think, because right now what's happening is, of course, for the last decade or more, we've been fighting to expand Medicaid in our state and bring those dollars into our state, provide healthcare to 275,000 Missourians and an influx of money into our healthcare economy, and stabilization to a lot of our providers, and a lot of jobs in the process. Now, of course, the legislature has refused to do that year after year after year. And so this past year, importantly, voters went to the polls, as you all know, and actually put the language for expansion into our Constitution. And I think that's really important that we all talk about here, especially you all advocating for voting rights and the importance of voting. Right now, what's happening in the House is the leaders of the House on the House side are trying not to fund expansion. This is really important because we've seen a lot of times when voters have gone to the polls and demanded certain things, and the legislature then goes and ignores them or undoes it. But in this case, they don't really actually have the authority to do that, because voters actually put it in the Constitution and use the ballot initiative process to demand it directly. And when you put something in the Constitution, that's supposed to mean it happens. Now, right now, what the budget chairman and some others in the legislature are trying to argue is, even though it's in the Constitution, they don't have to do it. And he says they don't have to do it because they don't have to fund it, and the power of appropriation stays in their hands. Now, of course, throughout that article of the Constitution, it lists a whole lot of limitations on our power of appropriation. It says that we have to spend 25% of our funds on education, for example. It also limits other revenue and says it has to go in very specific other places. No one's ever challenged that because it's in the Constitution and says we have to do it, and so we do it. Now, in this case, what's happening is they're saying, even though the Constitution says that the eligibility for Medicaid will include or shall include all of these folks that are in the expansion population, and it says not just that they shall be eligible, but that they shall receive coverage. And then it goes on to say that we can't put restrictions on them that are not on any other group that receives Medicaid. It's very clear that we don't have the ability by the power of the purse to say, well, we're going to deny Medicaid to this one group that the Constitution says should get it. Now, I went through this debate with the budget chairman on the floor in the last 2 weeks, and he continued to say, no, they can't. The Constitution can't tell us that. Well, what concerned me most for the long term is that this past week, as I pointed out, because he had tried to say, well, it said they're eligible, but he didn't say we have to fund them. And I said, no, it says they shall get coverage. He ultimately said, and a couple others argued, make us. And what I'm very worried to see is, okay, let's say they pull off not funding this and it goes to court and the court says, no, you have to fund it. And then it comes back to the budget committee and they say, no. Where do we go when we have a legislature that won't actually follow the Constitution? How does that get enforced? And I think that we're at a really dangerous place when we have that level of disrespect for our Constitution and the will of the voters. And I don't know where it lands. So we need the voices of people across the state demanding that we do our jobs, we respect our oath to the Constitution, and we respect the will of the voters. Thankfully, the governor has indicated that he intends to. A number of the senators on both sides of the aisle seem to want to. So this may be an interesting battle. We might end up getting there without it testing this really kind of fundamental constitutional crisis, if I may say so. But I think that needs to be at the front of everybody's radar right now when we're talking about just about anything else, because it really does go to the fundamental basics of how we operate as a government. Now, jumping from there, from Medicaid expansion, it is one of many things that has gone to the ballot in the last 5 or 10 years that we have seen voters approve of, that the legislature and the leaders in power right now in the legislature don't want to happen. So as a result, what we're seeing this year is a renewed and stronger push by those in power to actually weaken the ballot initiative process. So this would be my next big concern right now. We've got bills that would make it virtually impossible for many of these things to get on the ballot, and much, much, much harder to certainly amend the Constitution. For example, one of the things being pushed right now would increase the number of signatures required to 10% of all registered voters, and require that not just be in 6 of the 8 congressional districts, but all 8 of the congressional districts. That is a burden that is incredibly difficult to meet, certainly by grassroots organization. It would take a massive amount of money and rare organization like what Labor was able to pull off to be able to get that number of signatures in every single congressional district. And notably, it also means that if something is even the least bit culturally or partisan divided, it would make it hard for anyone to put it on the ballot. From a conservative standpoint, you really wouldn't be able to do anything without the cities on board. If you need 10% of the registered voters, I mean, we have elections where barely 10% of the voters show up to vote, let alone getting them to sign a petition. But from a more progressive side, organizing in rural areas where there aren't as many places of large populations in one place that you can gather signatures from, it becomes exceedingly hard to gather signatures. And so it would start to be the only issues that get on the ballot are those sent by the legislature, which sort of defeats the purpose here in a lot of ways, especially when they then look at adding other things like limits on the court's ability to rewrite titles that are false or misleading. So the language that goes on the ballot, if the legislature passes something to go on the ballot, they often write in the language in the bill that passes that says this is what's going to appear on the ballot. Now we saw this with the effort to undo clean Amendment 3 this last year, where they wrote language that was extremely deceptive. It first on the list was this minor change to lobbyist gifts that wasn't exactly clear on what it did. And then at the bottom of the list, it mentioned essentially undoing the will of voters on gerrymandering. Now, that led to some really confusing language that I talked to so many voters that read it, voted for it, thinking it sounded good, and then later found out more about it and went, what did I do? And it passed by a slim margin. Now, frustratingly, the courts did at least improve that language slightly from what the legislature had written. What the legislature had written didn't even mention the undoing of the redistricting changes. It simply stated this vague language about there being a bipartisan commission. It didn't say going back to what was done before that you all just changed. It didn't say appointed by the governor. Now, the first court rewrote the language completely, the trial court, in a very fair way. The appellate court then reined it back a little bit and kept some of the deceptive language, in my opinion, but not all of it. What the legislature is trying to do now is take away the court's ability to rewrite it at all. Now, that's completely irresponsible. And it's really just another push for power where they can write language that just lies to voters and gets them to vote for things that they don't intend to vote for. Now, I will say there is a counter perspective where what they may end up causing is the courts will be forced to instead just throw out ballot language that's unfair. And if they throw it out, well, the legislature won't get to put what they want on the ballot at all. So that wouldn't be the worst outcome in the world if that happens, to be honest with you, because if they find out if the court determines it's unfair, they'll just throw it out completely. So that's a big one to watch right now. But all in all, we need to focus on protecting the ballot initiative in Missouri. It is a really important piece of the process that allows voters to vote directly on issues and bypass the legislature when the legislature refuses to do its job. That's especially important when you have a horribly gerrymandered legislature that really doesn't represent the voters. I would argue it represents the most extreme interests, as folks generally have to compete in primaries more than they do in general elections. And so they're competing to be the furthest right, the furthest to the right on the political spectrum. And that's what we end up with in controlling the legislature. And that's just not fair to Missourians. And when Missourians also vote for people it gets tricky. You vote on cultural identity and personality, and a lot of other things get in the way, and you might vote on one or two issues, even though you disagree with people on a whole lot of others. Having the ability in our state to go directly to the polls on a specific issue allows us to have a more democratic system. And that's something we should all support. They are also pushing for a higher threshold for constitutional amendments. I would say if we didn't have a legislature that constantly likes to overturn what voters voted for, I might actually agree with that, that for amending the Constitution, there should be a slightly higher bar. I wouldn't go as high as they've gone in one of the bills to 2/3. I'd go at 60% probably. But frankly, as long as the legislature isn't listening to the people, I think we need a way for the people to demand it by putting it in the Constitution. The next big issue I would say that should be on all of our radar is, of course, redistricting. This is redistricting year. And since Clean Missouri was undone at the ballot, we're going to have another political process, a very partisan process for drawing the maps. But what we do have this year that we haven't had in the past in that process is more ways for the public to engage. I heard you all talking about this when I signed on. I didn't hear all of it, but what we're asking for is more engagement in this process. There will be tools available to folks to test out maps, to try drawing out maps as communities, to provide greater input as communities of interest, to make sure that a variety of interests are protected and that we aren't just looking at maps drawn in ways that favor the incumbents or specific incumbents, really, who happen to have more influence in that process, or specific parties who want to maintain power. Neither of those should be how maps are drawn. But here we are, we're going to have to fight within the system we've got. And I, for one, have a major learning curve in front of me. So I'll be looking to people who've been involved in this longer than me, and I know some of you have been, as we get down that process, and we could use help. We are expecting it also to be a pretty delayed process this year because of the delays in the census. So we're actually looking at the likely scenario where we don't know all the districts even when filing starts. So people will have to file without knowing what their exact district will be. So there's going to be a lot of confusion happening, and we're going to need some steady hands helping guide people on how to proceed. After that, big issues happening in Jeff City still right now on elections would include another push for voter ID yet again. And actually this push, I would argue, is worse than the previous one in a lot of ways, that they give less of an ability for people to fix the problems that were there before. Frankly, it was about a month ago that we debated this on the floor, and I'm not as fresh on it as I was that day. But I'm happy to discuss that if people have questions on what that looks like. I will say something that gets brought up a lot is, you heard me talking about respecting the will of voters. And there was a constitutional amendment about voter ID that shouldn't be ignored. And I don't want to pretend I'm trying to undo the will of voters by not passing voter ID. But there is a separate constitutional issue of voting rights at stake here. And we have to be very cautious when we put barriers in place that disenfranchise voters. That said, it's also important to realize that what was passed in the Constitution there, the language on the ballot said may, not shall, the legislature impose verification processes on voters when they vote to ensure the identity of the voters. That may include photo identification. That's all it said. So voters were just simply saying, yes, we're authorizing the legislature to make decisions about how best to verify voters at the polls. It definitely did not say with only a very specific type of government ID. And really, I think a lot of us might be more supportive of it if we just had more ways to verify voters. And frankly, I think a lot of us would agree we already have that. You already have to provide some verification, whether it's your voter card or your a utility bill that shows your address, or a photo ID that you're able to show now. And what the legislature is trying to do is provide where only very specific forms of ID can be allowed, not student IDs, not housing IDs, not a lot of the IDs that our most vulnerable populations that are less likely to have driver's licenses have. And that's an intentional way to disenfranchise voters. They also removed the language this year, if I recall correctly, that would make sure that those IDs have to be provided for free and the underlying documents that are required to get those IDs have to be provided for free. They removed that language. So if you need to go get a copy of your birth certificate in order to get your ID, not only do you have multiple places you're going to have to get transportation to get to in order to get your documentation, you're going to have to pay for it. And that, I would say, is a poll tax and a barrier to the poll that is not constitutional, and that I don't believe voters would have supported if they'd been given that choice on the ballot. So those are kind of the top concerns. There are a lot of other things moving through on elections. There is a minimal improvement to early voting. It's not as good as it ought to be, but it's a step in the right direction. But they're trying to make it contingent on voter ID surviving in court. So that's a problem. There are changes to election dates that I think are concerning that I'd be happy to talk about, but I don't think we need to get into the details of. There's a debate over closed primaries, making it so that if you don't actively register as a specific party, you wouldn't be able to vote in primaries. I think that's very concerning in a lot of areas of our state, where people might be more independent and want to sometimes vote in one and sometimes vote in the other, or just not declare a party, but they still want to have a say in the election. And some other things about election judges and poll watchers not having to be residents of their district, which can be concerning if they really truly believe that there's some voter fraud happening. How best do you check if people are who they say they are, other than have local people watching? Now, switching to some good goals that I think should always be at the front of the list. And some are bills I filed, some are bills filed by other people, are to remove the notary requirement and excuses for absentee voting, both by mail and in person. This, of course, has been a #1 priority for many of us for years on the election front, to make it just easier for people to vote. When you only have one day of the year they can vote in person, and it's a Tuesday where many people are working, that's just not easy for everybody. We need more options in order to make sure people can vote. Voting rights for inmates is a big one. If people are locked up, especially pre-trial, they haven't been convicted of any crime, that leads to some dangerous ways where if you lock a bunch of people up on the week of the election, especially protesters, you might imagine, they get locked up for a couple of days, never get convicted of anything, and they were just prevented from voting. That's a really dangerous thing that exists in our system right now. I've also pushed for automatic voter registration, where we can cross-reference databases like driver's licenses, tax rolls, and even school rolls for kids when they turn 18. You know, you automatically get registered for the draft when you turn 18. It should be that simple to be registered to vote as well. If we already know where you live and you're a resident of our state, we should make that happen. I also believe in same-day registration. At the very least, the ability to easily update your registration on the day of the election. A lot of people that are especially more transient, move from place to place, need to be able to update their registration when they go vote. And the fact that we have an arbitrary deadline many weeks in advance for that is really just a way to limit access to voting for many people. We also need some updates to our voting systems to make it so that in all counties, voters can vote at multiple locations, or as they do in Greene County, at any polling location. I know St. Louis City, for one, doesn't have the systems capable of that.
Yeah, St. Louis County.
And it requires some money to make that happen. And right now, we have a whole lot of federal dollars coming into our state. And I think this is one of those places that we would be able to use a small bit of that to update our systems to make it easier for people to vote. At least with central locations, if not at all polling locations. That way people could go to maybe the place closest to where they work on a Tuesday, instead of just the one by their house, which can often be harder. They have to go at rush hour times that they have to wait a long time, and it's just not convenient enough for people to do. National popular vote, I know, is something that I filed and others have filed that you all care about as well, to bypass this kind of nonsensical electoral college that is only making it so that Missouri is somewhat irrelevant in the presidential elections right now. You know, we saw significantly low turnout among Democrats in Missouri who weren't particularly excited by the presidential election because it seemed like it wasn't relevant for them to show up and vote this year, in part because the presidential campaign didn't spend any money in Missouri because they didn't see us as a place that they could win. When a state becomes irrelevant because the votes are considered not to matter, that's a bad thing for getting voters to care about elections. And I believe that every vote should count equally. And the way to do that is by bypassing the Electoral College. I will also say I strongly believe in a system for electronic signatures for ballot initiatives. This is something I've filed every year since I've been in office, and actually got passed in the House 2 years ago as an amendment on another bill. But I do believe that in order to improve access to the ballot and make it less expensive to gather signatures, we should be able to provide a system for people to sign electronically. It also means they have time to read what they're signing, time to look at pros and cons that can all be in one place even, rather than just trusting someone standing outside a grocery store saying, can you sign a petition to help the kids? And people often sign not really knowing what they're signing. Now, fortunately, I still think they have time before they vote at the ballot. So it's, it doesn't pass just by getting signatures, but I'd like more things to be able to be put on the ballot because they have broad support. And I think that would be a good way to do it. Lastly, some limits on the legislative ability to undo ballot initiatives could be good, like a delay in amount of time that they'd be able to come in and undo something. There are some other ideas out there that would be interesting as well. Happy to talk to you about. That's, I think, the full list of notes I made about 5 minutes before this of things that I thought were worth bringing up in this meeting. But I'm happy to talk about any of these things or other things on your mind while you got me here.
Well, thank you. That's quite a list. And I think you've just about covered some of the things that we've done at the League. I mean,
quite a lot of those have been at the front of your list.
We've been doing a lot of those for many, many years, unfortunately.
I'm just catching up to that.
One question I would ask is what some of us are looking for, because so many of these involve constitutional points which are in the Constitution now, basic rights, etc. It seems like the only answer to them perhaps will lie in the courts. And we are not shy to go to the courts.
Thank goodness.
Yes, but I'm just wondering, like, how many cases can we be running, supporting at one time? But a couple of these things people have wondered about, specific questions. You noted a bill that had the word may instead of shall in it, and I know that's what was done a couple of years ago in one of the voter ID bills.
That's
is there something they're running again, or are they running it again, or is this the new bill?
No, I was talking about the one they put in the Constitution before. We often hear pushback when we fight against voter ID, that they say, hey, aren't you the ones that say we have to listen to the will of voters, and voters voted for voter ID? And we have to point out, no, they didn't. Voters voted for very specific language that is not this bill. And I think it's really important to make that clarification. But I was not talking about a new push that they're doing that I'm aware of.
Okay, I have one more quick question, and then we have a couple in the chat. Talking about the primaries for president, back in 2014, Governor Nixon signed the bill, which did away with caucuses in Missouri.
Right.
And opened it up as it is now, where it was an open primary and that individuals could choose which party ballot they wanted. And we always get lots of phone calls around primaries from people who have moved here from another state where they were registered as a Republican, and where do they go to change their registration, all those kinds of things, which we don't have here. Is someone asking to reinstitute caucuses or what's going on with that?
So actually, there are two issues there, I think, that are worth mentioning. One is there's a bill specifically to get rid of the presidential preference primary that moved through the House, and that would make it so that we went back to just caucuses. Now, they make the argument that right now the presidential preference primary doesn't actually assign the delegates; the caucus does. However, it's really important that the caucus then does that based on what the results of the presidential preference primary was. And a primary is much more accessible to voters than a caucus, which takes much more time and a higher level of engagement, and often leaves people out of the process. So that is not something I support at all, but that is something they're trying to do. Then the second half of that is the closed primary issue. And some of the same people actually pushing the other one are also pushing for closed primaries whenever there's a primary. And that would in fact mean you have to register with that party as a member of that party in order to vote in their primary. And in places that are dominated by single party rule, or by a large majority at least, that's really dangerous. because often the election results are decided really ultimately by the primary. And so a lot of voters like to go in and make their choice in that primary. And if we take away their ability to do that without identifying as that party in advance, we're going to have two consequences of that. One, keeping a lot of people from voting, even people that might lean toward that party but prefer to call themselves independents, or failed to register in time with that party. But we're also preventing people from the other party from ultimately having a say in their elections. And some of them may go ahead and do it anyway, and just register with the other party so that they can vote there. And then we're also getting a sort of a false result, thinking that we're only dealing with members of that party when we're not. So I think it's just bad policy all around, personally.
Okay, one of the questions that has popped up deals with police reform. That's one of the league's main issues these days, racism, systemic racism, specifically police reform for St. Louis. Can you speak to that, and if anything's happening in the legislature?
You know, I swear this is an issue that we get a lot of bipartisan talk about. And then it feels like every time we start to make progress on it, when we have something good added, there are then two or three things that take us the opposite direction. And that's both police reform and also just criminal justice reform generally. Like on the criminal justice reform side, we often will have a bill that tries to lower penalties on something to try and reduce the amount of time people are spending in prison for small crimes. But then they'll tack on two or three things that actually add on penalties somewhere else, so that we're actually making the system worse there. The same is true for, there's a good bill right now moving on prohibiting the use of chokeholds. And this is a big one right now, especially, as George Floyd trial, the trial is happening right now, the officer that killed George Floyd. It gets support, but then in the House, it was watered down significantly to where it really wouldn't have had much impact at all. And they then added multiple amendments that would add additional protections, or so-called protections for police, to give them greater immunity when they misbehave or abuse their power. And it even would impose added penalties on protesters or on assaults against police officers, things that already have heightened penalties, and multiple heightened penalties, I should add. They would be adding additional heightened penalties to that aren't going to deter the behavior by any stretch. It's just going to mean locking people up for longer. And it's just been very frustrating that this conversation in Missouri has had very little progress. Now, I will say, I've had some really good bipartisan progress, even in the last week or two, with a couple of more moderate members who are pushing things to help improve further on municipal court and traffic violations, trying to reduce our approach to criminalizing traffic tickets and push it more toward a civil thing, which I'm a believer would really address a lot of the root problems for a lot of these situations that happen, where we especially see racial discrimination in how we police. A lot of that really happens in that traffic level. And if we could address that and reduce some of the criminalization of that, that would move us in a good direction. Similarly, reducing criminalization of drugs, I believe would go a long way on this. Drugs have often been used as a way to criminalize certain populations, especially populations of color and low-income populations. And we are seeing some bipartisan movement on at least decriminalizing marijuana. I filed a bill to do that every year since I've been in, and there's a Republican that for the first time filed it this year, but also addressing some of the racial inequities in that process and reducing some of the penalties on other nonviolent drug offenses as well are some of the things that we're talking about. But frankly, I'm not seeing much hope for major changes there in Missouri through the legislature anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. Another new area, totally new area, voter registration, which for the league is a big deal. We have over 250 of our members who register voters. And there being a bill that is talking about limiting voter registration by members of an organization.
Thank you.
What's happening with that? We don't like that.
Yeah, I forgot to bring that bill up. That was a terrible bill. And it's language in one of the other election bills as well. that would make it so that I think you can't pay people to collect signatures at all, and they have to be registered to do it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that the paying wouldn't apply to us, that part of it, but they would all have to be,
Yeah.
there's so much language in there that's sort of convoluted.
Yeah, the fact is it makes it a lot harder to register voters for any organization at all when you have to be registered to do it first. And you can't hire people to do it. A lot of organizations do spend some money at least to go hire people to go door to door and help register voters. Heck, my campaign did that this year. And not for the sake of my campaign, just to get more people to turn out to vote. I hired a couple of college kids to go door to door to places that I knew had low voter registration to try and help register voters. That would not be allowed if this bill passed. And I find that to be extremely problematic. Especially when we don't have things like automatic voter registration and same day registration and the kinds of things that would make it just easier for people to register.
Right. Well, we worked very hard to, one quick thing, comment, Louise, and then I'll call on you.
Okay.
We worked very hard to have the driver's license places, even the pay for fee and the state ones, have to offer a voting application to people for they move, when they get a driver's license. That's part of the law that I believe still is. They still have to do that. And many people of our members, Linda McDaniel, Kathleen Farrell, were in court for numerous times getting that upheld. So I certainly hope they aren't going to overturn that, but who knows? Anyway, Louise, you had a question?
Oh, I just about that particular bill. It's so onerous. What do you, Representative Meredith, what do you think are the chances that that bill will succeed?
I wish I could predict the Senate these days. It has no problem passing the House. Whether it can get through the Senate, I don't know. I wouldn't even put odds one way or the other, to be honest with you. I would not put anything past them these days, though.
Okay, so shout out to all league members, write the state senators, let them know we don't like that bill.
Yes.
And we would view it as a personal attack on us. I'm sorry. I'll turn it back over to Nancy.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to say, I think we need to schedule another Zoom meeting with Representative Meredith. I am happy
to do these anytime.
Exciting way to do it. Unfortunately, as our annual business meeting, we do have a number of things that we have to cover in addition to the stuff that we really love, which is advocacy and registering voters and doing all voter services. But once in a while, we have to do some business. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to be with us, to share with us.
Thanks for all you do.
And, I can't say you have our support because we can't support politicians.
But some of these causes do, I think.
But gosh, we agree with your positions.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Really, thank you all.
Bye now. All right, and moving on in our